I'm 31, and I recently inherited my grandparents' house. It's an old place, built in the 1940s, and it's always been this centerpiece of our family mythology. You know, the place where all the holiday dinners and whispered arguments happened. My grandfather, bless his heart, passed away 6 months ago. He was a good man, a quiet man, and a carpenter by trade. When the will was read, everyone was surprised I got the house. Not my older brother, who has a family, but me, the single guy who works remote and lives in a small apartment downtown. He just said he always wanted me to have a place with history. I thought it was sweet, a quiet acknowledgement of how much time I spent with him as a kid, learning to use his old tools in the dusty garage. Moving in felt like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was exactly where he left it, down to the stack of National Geographics on the coffee table. The only odd thing, which I noticed immediately, was this one stretch of wall in the basement, just past the laundry area. It was newer than the rest of the rough-hewn cinder block, a smooth, freshly drywalled section that didn't match the decade-old paint job. I chalked it up to a late-life repair, maybe a burst pipe he didn't want to deal with, but it always felt oddly cold when I walked past it. My first few weeks settling in were peaceful, if a little eerie. I spent my evenings painting over the dated floral wallpaper and scrubbing years of accumulated dust from the wooden floors. That basement wall, though, kept nagging at me. It wasn't just the texture, it was the dead space behind it. The house blueprints, the originals I found tucked away in an antique desk drawer, showed a continuous foundation line and a small shallow crawl space running beneath the sunroom extension. But there was no architectural reason for a brand new 6-foot wide section of drywall to be there. I even asked my dad about it, mentioning I thought maybe Grandpa fixed some water damage. My dad got instantly cagey. He told me Grandpa hated talking about the basement and warned me, with a strange intensity, to just leave that part alone, that it was probably just a structural patch and nothing more. The way he avoided eye contact and changed the subject so quickly only intensified my curiosity, making me feel like I wasn't just looking at a bad repair job, but at a deliberate, decades-old secret. I started tapping on the wall more often, and the sound was unmistakable. Hollow, deep, and definitely not the sound of a standard wall cavity. It sounded like a room. I finally decided to stop tapping and start investigating. My grandfather had left me all his tools, so I went straight to the garage and grabbed a small, sharp utility knife. I started by tracing the outline of the newer drywall section, searching for any seam or imperfection. There was nothing on the surface, just a flawless coat of beige paint. Standing back, I realized the seam had to be perfectly mudded and painted over. I took the knife, and with a slight tremor in my hand, plunged the tip into the wall just behind the heating duct. The blade went through the first layer of sheetrock with a muffled crunch, but then it hit something hard, something solid and wooden. It wasn't the expected framing. It felt like a door, or at least a solid barrier made of thick plywood or particle board. I cut a small, neat square out of the drywall, just big enough to peek through, and shone my phone's flashlight into the gap. The light didn't just hit dusty insulation, it vanished into a space that was entirely dark, maybe 7 or 8 feet deep. And then, I caught a faint smell. Not mold or damp earth, but a dry, woody scent mixed with something else. Something metallic and faintly chemical, like old varnish, or even some kind of preservative. I felt a sudden cold jolt of fear mixed with adrenaline, realizing this wasn't just a hidden storage space. This was an intentional, secret room. Knowing it was a deliberate secret changed everything. I couldn't just stand there staring through a hole the size of a coaster. I spent the next afternoon carefully prying the entire section of drywall away. Underneath, just as I suspected, was a door. It wasn't a standard interior door, but a heavy, custom-built barrier made from thick, dark wood planks, bolted together and fitted perfectly into the frame of the cinder blocks. The handle was a simple, tarnished brass latch, but what really stopped me was the lock. Not a standard house lock, but a heavy-duty combination lock, the kind you'd see on a safe or a workshop cabinet mounted high up. This was designed to be secure, and more importantly, to keep people out permanently. I sat back on the cold concrete floor, my heart pounding this slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had watched my grandfather for decades, observed his quiet routine, his predictable habits, and the idea of him constructing this fortress, this hidden compartment within his own home, was utterly unsettling. What did he keep so hidden that he had to build a custom vault in his basement? And why did he leave the house to me knowing this secret was inside? I tried every combination I could think of that was relevant to my grandfather. Birthdays, anniversaries, old phone numbers, even the year the house was built, 1947. Nothing worked. After an hour of fiddling and whispering frustrated curses, I was about to give up when I remembered something from my childhood. Grandpa had this old beat-up toolbox he always kept locked, and whenever I asked what was inside, he'd just chuckle and say it held the keys to the kingdom. I went back to the garage and found the toolbox right where it always was. It wasn't locked with a combination, just a simple key. Inside, nestled amongst old wrenches and rusty screws, was a tiny folded piece of paper, brittle with age. I unfolded it carefully. Written in my grandfather's neat, familiar handwriting were 5 distinct, seemingly random numbers. I rushed back to the basement, my hands slick with sweat. I carefully input the sequence into the combination lock, turned the brass knob one final, anxious time, and heard the satisfying, heavy clunk of the mechanism releasing. The silence that followed was deafening, and I knew the moment I pushed that heavy wooden door open, everything I thought I knew about my grandfather was about to change. I pushed the heavy door inward, and it groaned on rusty hinges, releasing a gust of that dry, chemical-like air I had smelled earlier. I flicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the space. It wasn't a large room, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, and it was entirely lined with shelves built from the same dark wood as the door. This wasn't a panic room or a bunker. It looked like a highly organized storage unit. But what was stored there wasn't canned food or spare furniture. The shelves were filled with journals, dozens of them, bound in leather, organized meticulously by year, dating all the way back to the 1960s. Next to them were stacks of loose-leaf papers, photographs, and what looked like old financial ledgers, all carefully labeled. In the center of the room stood a small, sturdy workbench, and on it, under a drop cloth, was a collection of instruments, a sophisticated-looking camera, several specialized woodworking tools I didn't recognize, and a massive, old-fashioned, reel-to-reel tape recorder. This wasn't the secret of a simple carpenter. This felt like the trove of a meticulous spy or a dedicated historian. My heart sank, realizing that the quiet, unassuming man I knew might have been living a double life. The greatest surprise, however, was in the far corner. A large, heavy safe, built directly into the cinder block foundation, easily twice the size of the one that had held his life savings. I didn't even bother with the journals yet. The massive safe was dominating my attention. It was old, black, and frankly terrifying, completely out of character for the man who drove a 10-year-old pickup truck and paid for everything in cash. The combination lock on this safe was unlike the simple one on the door. It was a complex dial mechanism, the kind you had to spin 3 times right, 2 times left, and so on. There was no tiny note taped to the outside this time. I felt a surge of pure frustration, staring at this final barrier. I searched the entire room, checking under the workbench, shaking the drop cloth, and flipping through the top journal, hoping for a clue. Nothing. Then I remembered the toolbox again. I rushed back to the garage, opening it up and digging deeper this time. Under a false bottom, another piece of Grandpa's clever carpentry, I found it. A worn index card. It didn't have numbers this time. It had names and dates. A woman's name I didn't recognize, Eleanor, and a date from 1958. Next to it, in smaller script, were 3 sets of numbers. I realized immediately. The numbers weren't the combination. They represented the years of the safe's setting. The combination must be Eleanor's birthday. I raced back, my mind spinning with who this woman could be, why her birthday was the key to my grandfather's deepest secret, and why he had kept her existence completely hidden from everyone, even my grandmother. Using Eleanor's birthday, I spent a tense 5 minutes slowly turning the dial of the heavy safe. The click, click, click was maddeningly slow. But finally, the heavy handle turned. The safe door swung open with a massive metallic sigh, revealing a small, carefully organized interior. Inside, there were no cash reserves, no gold bars, and thankfully, no human remains. Instead, it held just 3 things: a thick, unmarked manila envelope, a small, worn leather photograph album, and a single, heavy brass key attached to a tag that simply read, Deposit Box 72. I pulled out the photo album first. It was filled with pictures of a woman, Eleanor. She was stunningly beautiful, with dark, intense eyes and a smile that looked both joyful and terribly sad. She wasn't my grandmother. The photos chronicled a life. Eleanor as a young woman in the 50s, holding hands with my grandfather in places I didn't recognize, pictures of them laughing together, and then later photos of her with a small girl, a child who looked uncannily like a younger version of my own mother. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My grandfather had a completely secret parallel family, and that little girl was either my mother's half-sister or, maybe, just maybe, my mother's real mother. The simple life I thought my family had lived was a complete fabrication, built on a foundation of silence and lies. I sat there, frozen, the photograph album slipping into my lap, unable to reconcile the loving, gentle man I knew with the man who had maintained this decades-long deception. I finally forced myself to pick up the manila envelope. It was sealed with a wax stamp, but I carefully tore it open. Inside, there was no confession letter, no dramatic explanation, just legal documents. The contents were shocking. A deed to a small property in another state, a substantial life insurance policy made out to the name Eleanor, and most critically, a copy of a birth certificate. The name on the certificate was not my mother's. It belonged to the little girl in the photos, confirming she was Eleanor's daughter, born in 1961. My grandfather was listed as the father. But the truly chilling part was the last document, a recent one, dated just 6 months before his death. A transfer of ownership for a substantial trust fund, established for Eleanor's daughter, with me, the inheritor of the house, listed as the executor. It was a quiet instruction, a final silent assignment. He hadn't just left me a house, he had left me the burden of his secret family, tasking me with managing the finances of a woman I didn't know, a woman who was technically my aunt or half-aunt, depending on what else he had hidden. Update 1. I haven't told anyone yet. Not my father, and certainly not my grandmother, who, God rest her soul, passed away before Grandpa. I found a diary entry in one of the basement journals, dated 1965, where Grandpa wrote about a terrible decision he had to make, a choice that involved protecting the home while ensuring her future was secure. It's vague, but the timeline matches when Eleanor and her daughter disappear from the photo album. I'm holding the brass key now, the one for deposit box 72. I realize I have to go to the bank. Everything hinges on what is in that box. If it's just more documents, fine. But if it's a letter, a full confession, or worse, something that directly impacts my mother, I don't know how I'll handle the fallout. The house feels cold now, less like a sentimental inheritance, and more like a cage filled with ghosts and lies. I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove straight to the bank, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Deposit box 72 was located in a bank vault 30 miles away, exactly where the deed for Eleanor's property was registered. The bank attendant looked at the old brass key, checked my grandfather's documentation, and led me back to a private viewing room. When the heavy box was placed in front of me, I hesitated, feeling the weight of decades of unspoken history. Opening it, I found only 2 items: a thick packet of sealed letters addressed to Eleanor's daughter, and one final crisp white envelope addressed to me. I tore open mine first. It wasn't a rambling confession, just a single typed page. It explained that Eleanor had been the great love of his life before he met my grandmother, and when she became pregnant, he felt trapped by societal and family expectations. He provided for Eleanor and their daughter secretly for years, buying her the house and setting up the trust fund to ensure they were always cared for. The biggest shock came in the last paragraph. He explained that my grandmother knew. She had discovered the secret decades ago but chose to live in silence, demanding only that he keep Eleanor's daughter far away from our family life, which is why he had built the secret room to manage their affairs in total privacy. His final line was a plea. Tell no one. Just ensure Elizabeth, Eleanor's daughter, receives what is hers. This house is your inheritance, but her future is your duty. I walked out of the bank with the letters and the immense, terrifying responsibility of 2 families' worth of silence. I have the address now for Elizabeth. The house I inherited isn't a gift. It's the keeper of a terrible, beautiful truth. And now I have to decide how, or if, to finally break the silence and connect with the sister cousin I never knew existed. fulfilling my grandfather's last complicated wish. Update 2, final. I drove to Elizabeth's address. It was a charming, well-maintained house in a quiet neighborhood. I sat in my car for an hour, rehearsing what I would say. Ultimately, I just walked up and dropped the packet of letters into her mailbox, the ones from my grandfather, and a short anonymous note from me explaining that I was a distant relative and executor, and that the letters would explain everything about her trust. I drove away before she could open the door. I fulfilled his duty, but I couldn't bring myself to break the silence completely by putting a face to the secret. I'm back in the inherited house now, staring at the perfectly re-drywalled section in the basement, sealing the secret room once again. I have the resources to find Elizabeth and tell her the whole story. But now that I know my grandmother lived and died keeping this painful truth, I realize the burden of silence is its own kind of inheritance. I don't know if I'm protecting her memory or just taking the easy way out. Am I doing the right thing by keeping this secret buried, just like Grandpa wanted?